What's good, everyone? In this video, we'll be continuing on with the Strands SDK series, and specifically, we'll explore a multi-agent pattern with graphs. And within graphs, as you'll notice, you can build many different types of workflows. The idea that I want to do, at least in these next few videos, is cover some of the kind of common topologies or patterns that you might see when people are utilizing graphs with multi-agents that are kind of common in the industry space. So that's exactly what we'll do. We'll start off theoretically just kind of revisiting what exactly a graph object is, how that's implemented within Strands. If you're new to it, I'd still recommend kind of looking at the multi-agent architecture series or video that I shared. I'll link it down below. But then what we'll do is we'll quickly get hands-on with using the graph builder object, which is a Strands component or object that we're working with, and we'll showcase how you can specifically build sequential graphs with it. So it should be a pretty simple introduction to this, but we'll just get you acclimated as always with some of the different API calls or some of the different objects that you might be working with. And once you become familiar with them, you should be able to kind of build your own powerful kind of workflows with the SDK itself. So before we even get into sequential graphs, right, there's graphs as a pattern within multi-agents itself. And within multi-agents, right, the reason there's been a need for this, as we talked about, I won't talk of it too much here, is it can get hard for an agent to just have hundreds or tens of tools that it's working with, and that can often lead to errors. It's become more and more important to have multi-agent systems where each one has more of a specialty or purpose, where you can kind of modularize and apply best practices, similar as you would in software engineering across these agentic workflows as well. And one of the common patterns that became popular was graphs, because traditionally, right, as engineers that who might be building this, or just anyone who's building a Gen AI application, we want some level of control in terms of the orchestration or how the workflow is going to look end to end. And while patterns such as maybe agents as tools, which is what we discussed before, and then there's patterns such as Swarm, where it's autonomous decision making by a group of kind of agents, are great if you really want complete kind of control over the customization. Then defining a graph is traditionally the best route to go because you can kind of build the topology that you're working with. So before we get into even constructing the graph, there's a few things or objects within that graph that you want to understand. And for those of you that come from a traditional software engineering background, that have kind of studied data structures or anything of that sort, this will look a little familiar to you. So nodes right here, right? Nodes are kind of the inflection points within the graph. So these can be agents, tools, whatever else you might be working with, right? These nodes are basically kind of representing those different agents or different kind of objects or characters that we're dealing with here. To connect these different characters and things of that sort, we have edges. And now there might be default edges where you just say agent 1 is linked to agent 2, basically take the output of agent 1 and feed it into agent 2, which is kind of similar to what we're going to be doing here. And then you might also have conditional edges, which is something that we'll talk about implementing specifically within Strands in the next video. And a conditional edge might be like, hey, only execute agent 2 if agent 1 returned this output. If it returned this output, execute agent 3 maybe. So you can introduce some sort of conditionality. You can think of the traditional kind of if statements or things of that sort. A bit of a function that you can introduce. And to be able to introduce a function like that, right, you need access to something known as state. And the state is basically the state of it's kind of in the word itself there. But in terms of the results within the agentic system, and there's going to be state for the entire workflow. So for example, you'll see maybe that agent 1's output is currently this. Access that state, and depending on if agent 1 output is, for example, maybe less than 100, proceed to execute agent 2. If it's greater than 100, proceed to execute agent 3. And then based off those results, make an informed decision in terms of what to execute after, right? So with state, you can basically introduce even further customization depending on what your agent's returning in a traditional real world use case, right? Maybe you can think of this as, let's say you have a stock trading agent and you have one agent, right, that's pulling down stock data. And you notice that maybe, for example, it's just making up numbers. Yahoo's price is less than $100. Maybe you have one agent that submits a buy. Obviously, this is once again simplifying it. You can maybe have an agent with all the functionality in one, but just as an example, maybe you have one agent that submits a buy. If it's greater than 100, then maybe you have an agent that submits a sell. So that's the type of conditionality that I'm describing in terms of accessing that state and having that conditional edge there. We won't get into conditionality itself in this video, that'll be the next one, but just these three kind of constructs are really what you need to know whether you're using Strands or any other multi-agent framework. Don't get like overwhelmed by all the terminology. It's just these three things get implemented by different multi-agent frameworks in kind of their own way. And you can imagine, right, these different topologies. Now, the one that we'll work with today is called sequential. But with sequential, as you can imagine, we're going to have a very simple execution flow where it might be A1, A2, A standing for agent, right there where it executes like that. And like I said, as you get more complicated, if you have some sort of conditionality that you might be working with, you might maybe have A1 right here, and maybe A1's output is parsed by A2 and A3. And depending on this conditional edge right here that you might have defined, once again, this is a mock, maybe it's A4 that we get executed to there, or maybe A5 there. A certain kind of delineation in terms of how all this is happening. And even that supervisor architecture that we talked about, you can define in your own graph if you want, if you don't want to go with the whole agents as a tools kind of architecture. But essentially, right, you have complete control over the customization of your workflow. And this kind of mixes the best of both worlds in terms of an agent executing things for you, but you as an engineer also still having some level of control over it. And now what I want to do is get out of this whiteboard and I want to introduce the object for which Strands will be implementing all of this right here, right? So if I come in here, I come to the Strands documentation. I'll link all of this down below as always. You'll notice that a lot of the same concepts that we talked about, graph node, graph edge, are going to be discussed here. And you can see there's an optional condition that can also happen with these edges, right? Which is what's connecting these different nodes. The object of interest for you that we'll be working with in this video and all future graph videos is the graph builder. And if you'll see, this graph builder basically takes in three kind of inputs: the nodes, which are your different agents or tools; the edges, which is how these are all connected, these graph nodes; and the entry point is where your workflow is going to start. And using this construct, right, you can build some pretty powerful kind of topologies, and you'll see that there's different graph topologies that they've described here that's kind of similar to what we're going to be working with. The first one we'll implement is a sequential pipeline, but as you get more and more complicated, right, you can have more logic in terms of how you want your workflow to be happening. And you can see here, these conditional edges inherit something known as a state object. And with the state object, basically, right, we can parse the result from the prior agent, essentially, and have a logic there in terms of what we're dealing with, right? So think of this basically as you customize this farther and farther, you can kind of build your workflow as you want. With that being said, right, I'll hop into Cursor. Our friend is always here, and ignore what's happening down here. This is already some stuff that I need to execute for our workflow. I'll explain why we have to click all that within the shell itself. But if we come here, you'll see that I've set up a few things. Our use case for our sequential pipeline, similar to what we were seeing in the docs, let me return here, is that we're going to have, first, I've adjusted this use case a little, just to give something more custom or new here. We're going to have two agents. Our first agent is actually going to create some mock data that is supposed to mimic transactional data that you might be dealing with or things of that sort. This mock data, right, that we can call this our data creation agent that we're working with there, is then going to be parsed and analyzed by a data analysis agent, which is going to generate a report, give me some general trends in terms of how my spending's been, things of that sort, and just give me a better understanding in terms of what I'm working with there. So if you see similar to kind of what we worked with agents as tools, I have a separate Python file. I'm going to keep clicking yes here, by the way, down below, and I'll explain all this in a second. But here I'm going to define my prompts for each of those agents, and I'm basically going to assign these to each of the agents that I'm going to be working with. So if I see here, I'm also defining that I'm working with Claude 4, once again for my model. You can bring your own here if you want, but if you use Bedrock, which is just pretty simple to set up here, I recommend using Claude Son 4, which is the latest of the Anthropic models supported at the moment here. If we then go to my main Python function here, or main Python file here, sorry, right? We'll see that I'm just going to import the model that we're working with. I'm going to import the two prompts for the two different agents. And then it's a very simple process in terms of actually creating the agents. And once again, take a look at the Strands intro video if you're kind of new to any of these constructs that we might be working with. I'm going to import agent. I'm going to provide a default shell tool, and that's what's executing here actually beneath. And I'll explain everything in a second. And then I'm going to import one new construct for us, the graph builder, which is what's going to help us build these graphs out, right? And if I come here, I'll see that I'm going to get my model, which is Claude V4. or Sonnet v4 that I'm working with. I'm going to have my data creation agent that I'm working with right here. And in this data creation agent, right, I'm going to have a shell tool. And the reason for the shell tool is, right, if you remember the prompt, I'm saying create a mock CSV file with transactional data. Obviously, in a real world use case, right, you might be retrieving, especially for transaction data, maybe from a played type API that you're working with. But since this is just a bit of a prototype or a proof of concept, we're just going to create a CSV file ourselves. And I've kind of clearly delineated and explained that you need a transaction date, an amount, and transaction category that we're working with. And for this, I specify clearly that we should be using the shell tool. So if we see here, right here within that, that's why we pass in that shell tool, because the shell tool has the power to create Python, not just Python files, but any types of files, and access kind of your working directory to be able to work with everything. Then my second tool, right, is a data analysis agent. And if you remember in that prompt, what we're going to do is we're going to look for a CSV file in this data analysis prompt, and we're going to take these different kind of categories that we have here, and then we're basically going to prepare a bit of a report where we're analyzing things like number of transactions, general trends, what am I spending in for the most part, and things of that sort. And if we see here, that's just going to instantiate those agents. And this is all stuff that we already kind of learned as we were working with strands and agents and understanding them further. Now, this next function is the new part for us, and we're going to start very, very simple for this video. What we're going to do is we're going to create the agents, but then we're going to instantiate a graph builder object. And for that builder object, we have two different nodes that we're working with, right? The first node is going to be the data creation agent. So this is what's going to create our CSV file, and that's what you see is being conducted down here. And the second node is going to be our data analysis node. And this is what's going to take that CSV file, parse it, and understand it better, right? And if we see here, I'm just going to connect one edge. There's just one edge here. I'm going to connect it from data creation, which is the source, to the target, which is the data analysis node. And the final thing I specify here is, right, I set the entry point to data creation. So this is where my workflow is going to start, and I want to build this graph end to end. Right now at the time of Strands, I don't think there's a UI component where we can kind of visualize this, but I think that's the feature request that if you want, you can put into the Strands SDK. But essentially, you can draw this out. That's what I did. And I just kind of connected everything together and got a better idea. What we'll also introduce is talking about length views and how we can maybe trace this. That's a concept that's coming shortly. But then I define this graph, right? And I basically say take a sample prompt, and we can execute this graph with what we're working with, right? So it instantiates and builds out that graph we're handling, and then we can pass in a sample prompt. And now I pass in a sample prompt saying generate a CSV file with mock transaction data for the month of June. And if you remember the prompt, I said, depending on the month that's passed in, make that the file name. So we'll see June.csv, then analyze the data and give me a report. And if you remember in our config for our data analysis, I also said make a text file, basically capture the report in a text file in the current directory in terms of all the trends and everything that you're seeing. And the reason, by the way, now that I can explain this, that you saw all these shell commands right here where I had to click yeses. Basically, this is the shell tool asking for permission to write and create these files here. You can override this default shell tool provided by Strands and probably have some custom logic, or maybe there's an environment variable that I might have missed. I'm being a little lazy here, where you can basically say yes by default. But also for best practices, right? If there is some type of action that's being taken place of that you don't want to approve, that's the reason you have this kind of command here where I had to keep clicking yes, because it wanted to make sure basically that this is something that we're authorizing because this is impacting our working directory immediately, right? So be a little careful with that. But if you want to override it, it's an open source Python library, so I'm sure you can adjust the implementation, or there's probably an environment variable there that you can set within the agent creation itself. I can research that and share that too if I discover something new. But if we see here, right, after this, you'll see the chain of thought that has happened basically. And I also asked for the execution order to be printed out. You can see this in the main function. While this graph is executing, you can also get, after successful graph execution, you can get the order in which these nodes got executed. And it happened the way we expected, data creation and data analysis basically. And if we see too, it generated a June.csv file. And we'll see that in the initial steps here. You'll see that it's creating this June.csv using that shell command that we're talking about. Verifies all that, works through with that. And then you'll see that we have the same tool for both of these agents, right? And we'll see here, it then asks for authorization in terms of reading this data, and then also creating basically this report. So it has to generate another June.txt file, right? So we have the CSV file here with all our mock transactional data. We'll see we have a text file here too, basically with the summary in terms of kind of the things that we were talking about. $27,000 in the month of June. I don't know why it said 2024. Maybe we could specify that, but just the prompt, play around with it as you want. If I spent that much, I definitely would have to move out of New York at this point. But you can see there's basically the different types of categories or things that you're working with, right? And you might be asking, like, can't we just do all this with a singular agent? Yes. Once again, this is a prototype to kind of introduce the graph builder object for you. What I encourage is taking this as a sample and expanding upon it. Maybe connect the first agent to the Plate API and have some custom Python logic in your own tool for writing that CSV file and kind of structuring this the way you want. And then maybe along with your analysis agent, maybe you want to have some multimodality, right? There's multimodal support within Strands where you can maybe generate a pie chart or a graph based off all of this, right? So fully up to you in terms of the control that you want. But we'll see here basically, right? This report's been generated. You can see here in our kind of actions here in terms of what's happening as this report's been created, as these tools are getting executed in this graph workflow, you'll see that it executes as expected in terms of using both of these. So that report's been generated, our status shows is completed, and we can see that our graph execution is successful and the order in the nodes. And there's more results that you can also print out in terms of this. So if you come to graph results in the documentation here, if you want to see how many nodes actually got executed, so like I said, this is sequential, so everything gets executed, but let's say you have some sort of conditionality, then maybe only 3 out of the 5 nodes get executed, right? In terms of the completed nodes that you might be dealing with. Any failures that you might have dealt with, once again, we'll also talk about integrating something like length view, some sort of tracing object here, the execution time, and the token usage. Because remember, these are multiple LLM calls that might be happening in a multi-agent type workflow. So you can kind of print all this out, get a better understanding in terms of it, and in terms of what you're dealing with and working with. So yeah, at a high level, I think that's mainly what I had for today. I wanted to introduce probably the simplest kind of topology in terms of sequential. In coming videos, as I was kind of alluding to, we'll talk about introducing things such as parallel processing, but I also, before even getting to that, wanted to introduce the natural next step, which is baking in that kind of conditional edge, which will allow for you to build really, really powerful applications, right? So yeah, that's mainly what I had. And if you had any questions, as always, feel free to leave below in the comments or reach out to me directly on LinkedIn and Twitter. If you like the video, feel free to leave a like and subscribe, and I will make sure to be back soon with more content in this space. Thank you as always. Talk to you soon.